Ok.
Bom dia, bem-vindos, bem-vindas. Nós recomeçamos, então, a programação do Estéticas no Centro, com a apresentação da professora Natalie Scholz, que é professora de História Moderna e Contemporânea no Departamento de História da Universidade de Amsterdam. Ela é doutora em História pela Universidade de Münster, na Alemanha. Trabalhou como pesquisadora visitante bolsista da Fundação Humboldt na Universidade Livre de Amsterdã, em 2005, e também foi bolsista na Universidade de Colônia e obteve as prestigiadas bolsas de pesquisa do Instituto de Constance e no Instituto de Estudos Avançados dos Países Baixos. Sua pesquisa é focada na intermediação cultural e emocional entre regimes políticos modernos e identidades étnicas, transnacionais e de gênero. Entre vários artigos publicados e livros, há um em português, publicado na revista Trama, intitulado Gênero e Moralidade das Coisas nos Primeiros Anos do Pós-Guerra na Alemanha. Foi publicado na revista Trama Interdisciplinar em 2015. Vocês vão então ouvir a professora, que vai apresentar em inglês, e em seguida nós abriremos para as questões. O título de sua conferência é The Homelessness of Postwar Cosmopolitanism, the Case of West Germany. So I would just say some words to our guests. Welcome, Natalie.
Hello.
Welcome.
Nice
Yeah, welcome back to Brasilia in a remote way, but even so, yeah, it's very. We're very happy that we could join us, and so I'll let you speak. We have about 1 hour for your talk and questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carla, and thank you, Carla and Miguel, for inviting me. I'm really happy to do this, and I will just start right away so that we have more time, hopefully, for discussion. See, I'm not sure if it works like this. Okay, I have to change. Yes. Stories about traveling and homecoming have a strong mythic potential as aesthetic forms to reflect on the human condition. In the modern era, some of those narratives have constructed cultural foundations for the big nation-building projects, and others have accompanied colonial endeavors and their inherent violence, and often both were interrelated. In their myth-making capacity, such stories are related to the idea of a home in a double way. First, the home usually marks the place where the narrated journey begins and ends. Second, the story itself can become so familiar that it is perceived as an element of one's own cultural home. Right now, we are living in a historical moment when many circulating stories that were once familiar cultural home are re-examined critically for their mythical quality and their problematic ways of distorting the past. Meanwhile, artists use their creativity to rework and transform old myths in order to tell stories about travel and home from new angles, thereby helping us to transcend some of the imaginative restrictions ingrained in the older stories. And I'm thinking here of films that have impressed me a lot, like Cheo Guerra's El Abrazo de la Serpiente and Alfonso Cuarón's Roma. The former radically transforms European stories of adventure and discovery in South America. The latter does something similarly radical with bourgeois European notions of home and family. When big culture-defining stories come under intensified scrutiny, the work of a historian is affected deeply in many ways. In my own work as a cultural historian of Western Europe, I have become particularly fascinated by the collective experience of the end of the Second World War as a deep political, material, moral, and also cultural crisis and by how, in reaction to this moment, a very successful story was created. And this story constructed a post-war West that renewed itself in a nearly magical way, and thereby reconfirmed itself as a beacon of modernity. In this successful story, the West German recovery and accompanying economic miracle occupies a special place, in spite of the fact that the Federal Republic was the successor state of the Third Reich, whose violent war campaigns in Europe had been responsible for the deep crisis in the first place. During the first 15 years after the Second World War, a collective myth emerged in West Germany about West German society and its place in history, which had the power to make these kinds of contradictions disappear from view. The center of this myth was a belief that the consumption and export of industrial commodities distanced and redeemed West Germany from the Nazi past and placed the country squarely again within the present of an evolving post-war West that imagined itself as cosmopolitan. The idea of cosmopolitanism that underpinned this new myth about West Germany also pervaded discourses in other West European countries and the US, and was propagated by Marshall Plan-sponsored exhibitions. This version of cosmopolitanism built on the promise of a consumerism that would result from modernized industrial production based on principles of productivity, national trade of commodities within the Western Hemisphere. This mythic story of post-war cosmopolitanism did not really have humans as protagonists. The commodities themselves, miraculously being born out of the power of machines fed by human creativity, largely took over this role, and in doing so, traveled around the world to connect people across national boundaries, creating a peaceful, globalized community of modern consumers. This consumer cosmopolitanism was also linked to a certain understanding of modern aesthetics, whose core aspects influence Western countries' modern architecture and interior design, and especially the widespread notion of a modern home filled with merchandise produced in the various countries of the West. This myth contributed to a vision of capitalist modernity that defined itself as both timeless and radically new. Post-war cosmopolitan aesthetics contributed to a perception of consumer modernity that effectively tore it out of concrete historical contexts. At the end of the 1960s, in her series entitled House Beautiful, Bringing the War Home, the US-American artist Martha Rosler injected the reality of the ongoing Vietnam War into photographs of modern model interiors. Applying the technique of photomontage, her work reassembled what mainstream consumer culture presented as polar opposites. The modern home was coded as cosmopolitan in the 1950s and 60s. If that was so, and if cosmopolitanism was understood as a project of peace, these images fundamentally disturbed such assumption. In dominant discourses, the modern home was supposed to be a place separated from the realities of war. Rosler's House Beautiful series shattered this assumption and made the homely, the familiar and homely, unhomely, and one could also say uncanny. I mention Rosler's work here because it reminds me, and it has reminded me, of some of my own unexpected experiences in the archives of the past. These experiences invited me to become curious and to start investigating how the historical material I encountered made historical connections that were disturbing to me often invisible, and how this effect worked primarily through the iconic, silent, and seemingly ahistorical power of the material world of commodities. In 1957, a feature film entitled Franziska was released in West German cinemas that told the story of a love between a woman finds her place in West Germany as a designer of modern costume jewelry, and her husband, Stefan, who lives a rootless life, traveling the world as a newsreel reporter and preventing the couple from properly settling down, thereby creating the central conflict. After having tastefully redecorated Stefan's old house, Franziska develops her career and sells her jewelry to Munich and also Chicago and Baltimore. The happy ending comes about when Stefan eventually becomes the photo editor of a famous West German lifestyle magazine. At a moment when the economic miracle was in full sway in West Germany, the movie Franziska gave the aesthetics of the home a central role in defining the two main characters and their challenge, and thereby echoing much of the ideas spread in lifestyle magazines of the time and newspapers. The chaotic mixture of global souvenirs and antiquated furniture in Stefan's old house embodies his moral deficiency, while Franziska creates for both of them a morally and aesthetically proper place within post-war West Germany and the Western world. When Stefan finally understands the value of this kind of home, the two solve their conflict and become successful and happy citizens of West Germany's globalizing consumers' republic. So Franziska fits in very well with the moment's emphasis on interior design and internationalization. In 1953, the Marshall Plan exhibition We Are Building a Better Life had introduced the idea of a recognizably modern aesthetics of the home in Western Europe and the USA. The idea was not only welcomed in West German publications, highbrow publications, up to a future as a vital member of the Western world, leaving behind the violent and nationalist past of the Third Reich. I came across the film early on in my research process, many years ago, and was excited about how perfectly it encapsulated so many aspects of the modern era's popular and political imaginary. Oh, okay.
Also ich glaube, du musst kurz warten.
Sorry, I don't think so. Somebody tells, my husband tells me that it's disrupted, but I think that's not true, right? You hear me? Okay. So I just continue. Sorry for that. Okay, where was I? As a mediator, which enabled West Germany to open up to a future as a vital member of the Western world, leaving behind the violent Nazi part. So I came across this film early on in my research process many years ago and was excited about how perfectly it encapsulated so many aspects of the era's popular and political imaginary. After a while, however, I discovered that the film was a remake of a Nazi film from 1941, entitled Goodbye, Franziska. To a large extent, the remake told the same story as the original, with two exceptions. In the original, Franziska ends her career as a designer when she becomes a wife, And more importantly for my interest here now, the male character realizes the value of his family home in order to learn why he has to leave his home again and defend it as a soldier in the beginning Nazi war. This ending gave Goodbye Franziska a distinct political meaning. The film premiered in April 1941, just 2 months before the German army attacked the Soviet Union and began what historians now call the War of Extermination in the East. The main aim of the second phase of the war was to extend the German Empire into Eastern Europe in a settler colonial way. Its racist agenda manifested itself in the extraordinarily brutal warfare against native inhabitants deemed racially inferior, and in the systematic murder of the Jewish population and other ostracized groups. Leading up to this phase of the war, Goodbye Franziska was a major success with German audiences, and arguably played a role in gaining Germans, at least some of Germans' support. It told a story of how female endurance and an ideal German home helped to canalize the male character's ruthless form of adventurousness into his willingness to serve the greater good of family and nation. The discovery of this movie produced a conundrum. What did it mean that a post-war film which so perfectly represented cultural elements usually interpreted as defining West Germany away from its Nazi past turned out to be a remake of a film deeply enmeshed in Nazi culture? Just like Rosler's House Beautiful series, this new insight suddenly placed pieces of the past together which were usually perceived as separated, and thereby made aspects of the past appear unhomely, so unfamiliar, uncanny, which were usually presented as homely, as familiar, part of our present. The discovery of the remake sent me on an unexpected journey to revisit some symbolic and narrative pillars of West German consumer modernity and to explore their cultural relationship with past and present and contemporary histories of violence. From this exploration, post-war cosmopolitan modernity emerged as an aspect of a story told and retold with a mythic character. This mythic story encapsulated traces of past relations of violence in a form that also made them invisible. In doing so, however, it continued a framework that had made these relations of violence possible in the first place. Viewed from this angle, a key characteristic of post-war cosmopolitan modernity appears as hiding the unhomely inside the homely. Goodbye Franziska from 1941 conveys central aspects of the Nazi worldview and connects the morality and the aesthetics of the home to visions of an aggressively expanding German empire. The film also exposes the alienating dangers of immersing oneself in exotic cultures and foregrounds female endurance and sacrifice. The 1957 remake substitutes the original's prospect of a bright future to be secured through military expansionism by highlighting the peaceful promise both of a moralized aesthetic consumerism and of West Germany's export boom. This new ending obviously deviated sharply from the Nazi project of violently conquering new colonial living space in the East, which had informed Goodbye Franziska. Reading Franziska from 1957 in the light of 1941 Goodbye Franziska nevertheless throws a different light on the post-war promotion of modern home aesthetics and the West German consumer's imagined relation to the world at large. In 1941, the Nazi version of colonial conquest in its close relation to the good German home was presented as the necessary alternative to the male character's life of adventures which estranged him from his home, his nation, and his folk. In 1957, this outcome was replaced by the consumerist dream of a well-organized and aesthetically harmonious world embedded in a transnational network of commodity circulation. This dream, however, was still related to the world at large in a manner that continued many echoes of the original movie. The 1957 Franziska movie presented its post-war message by revisiting, reproducing, and adapting much of the original story and its implicit political meanings. The film represented the world outside the West as having an alluring, disorienting, and pernicious exotic character, which was to be controlled, domesticated, and integrated into a home designed along the lines of moralized aesthetic principles. At the center of both narratives, both cinematic narratives, there is the idea of a right and of a wrong way to be at home in the world. Franziska, the figure, embodies the right way with her sense of duty, whereas the male character, called Stefan in 1957 and Michael in 1941, embodies the wrong way with his unstable and rootless life. On his journeys, the male character risks being sucked into and losing himself in the cultural alienation of exotic worlds. Through these themes and their staging, both films reinforce negative and positive stereotypes by contrasting foreign and domestic scenes. At one crucial moment in both versions of the film, the male character receives a letter informing him about the birth of his son in Germany, while he is partying in a bar in some exotic setting, surrounded, as you see here, by lascivious women and jazz music. With its exposition of alcoholic and sexual excess, the scene explicitly exposes the dangers of an unbridled life in a chaotic, culturally and racially mixed environment, in contrast to the well-ordered German home inhabited by Franziska, to which the male character then promptly returns with the resolution of marrying her and entering into respectable life. Crucially, the film systematically links this contrast of characters to the two main characters' equally contrasting relationship to domestic material culture. The danger of the male character's estrangement from his cultural roots is captured in his old inherited house, which is characterized by the chaotic mixture, an overstuffed and eclectic mixture of old furniture and exotic souvenirs from around the world. So you see, as you see, the 1941 movie always on the left and the 57 on the right. When Stefan Michael shows Franziska around in his home, Franziska dismisses his superficial relation to these objects, yet recognizes the aesthetic value of some exotic pieces, while he explains that he randomly picks them up somewhere and quickly loses interest in them. This opposition between both characters is even more fully established when they meet for the second time in Berlin, where Franziska, meanwhile, has started an independent life as a designer. Both films construct a contrast between the eclectic interior of Michael Stefan's inherited house and Franziska's modern Berlin apartment, which she explicitly describes as embodying her own character. In the 1941 film, Michael's old house reappears redecorated by Franziska with white walls, less cluttered and more spacious. Instead of exotic objects, we see old armchairs newly upholstered with then fashionable paisley patterns. Even though this is not a modern interior in the strict sense, it certainly evokes Werkbund principles with its clear spatial arrangement and stylistic order. The selective incorporation of two exotic objects gives them an appropriately subordinate place within the proper aesthetic of a German home. So here's the South Sea object, and this is actually a Chinese chair. Considering that Germans encountered the fascist politicization of German living culture along the lines of Werkbund, German Werkbund principles of modern aesthetics in countless media of the time, the movie's skillful use of the silent world of objects strengthened, arguably, its ideological message. The set design and its place in the narrative closely links Michael's conversion to the value of family life with dominant ideas about the meaning of home aesthetics as they were disseminated during the Third Reich. When Franziska redecorates what used to be Michael's eclectically furnished home, she integrates it into a new national whole in the making. When Michael is called to serve the cause of a greater Germany, she explains to him that his desire to, quote, conquer worlds at any cost merely makes sense in its connection to the home, which effectively meant the Germanized home of the National Socialist project. Now, in the 1957 film, the interior of Stefan's redecorated home is equally placed in contrast to the exotic world in which the boundaries between Europe and non-Europe, white and non-white, dissolve. The cheerful yellow accents of the family home's interior are reminiscent of the bright colors that were emphatically promoted in the magazines of the time as part of the internationalized modern home. At the end of the 1947 movie, maps show the movement of the German army before Michael is leaving for the war. At the end of the 1957 movie, we see Stefan in his role as a photo editor standing in front of a world map inside the modern interior of the magazine's office, giving advice to his correspondents for their trip to Asia. The last scenes show the reconciled couple inside a newly rented, bright and modern, yet still empty apartment. Reviewers of the 1957 film regularly compared it to the original, whose entanglement with Nazi propaganda was referred to in a very self-evident manner. The new ending was appreciated as a morally improved or, quote, redeeming turn of the plot, yet the ending was also criticized as implausible. For many reviewers, the memory of 1941's Goodbye, Franziska was obviously connected strongly to a past feeling of being at home. The conspicuous role of the home's aesthetic and its relationship to foreign worlds is a key aspect of how these two films attempt to produce an emotional truth. After the war, a new perception of the cultural relationship between the home and the world was constructed on the basis of a past that lingered on in the form of, you may call it, structures of feeling, whose histories were both present and concealed. West Germany's modern home was supposedly redeemed from its past by an aesthetic cosmopolitanism which had itself emerged from the cultural context of a not yet post-colonial West. If we use the term cosmopolitan to describe the internationalization of the modern home in West Germany, it should not be understood as unambiguously inclusive. Studying the meanings of this internationalization from a critical angle requires acknowledging cosmopolitanism's longer intellectual history as a project of peace that was conceived, in Walter Mignolo's words, quote, from one particular location, that of Europe of the most civilized nations, unquote. In order to avoid reproducing this pattern, it is necessary to apply border thinking and look at the discourse of post-war internationalism by focusing on those realities, people, objects, and aesthetic appearances which were positioned at or outside its borders. The discourse on modern design in Germany, in connection with the German Werkbund, which was founded in 1905, continuously promoted the idea of shaping national culture as an organic and aesthetic whole by transforming public and private spaces according to the new ideas about good forms. For the Werkbund, the inherent superiority and purity of the good German form was also meant to help conquer world markets and legitimate global dominance. This influential discourse is better known for its attempts to develop a socially inclusive aesthetics and to discard the remnants of feudal hierarchies in the guise of decorative historicist styles, so the kind of styles that were also in Stefan's or Michael's old home. At the same time, however, one of its central characteristics was how it combined beliefs in national and also racial superiority, which were common in all of Europe, with a fundamental moral dichotomy between good and bad forms. The underlying assumptions about aesthetics and the nation went then on to deeply shape Nazi policies and propaganda during the Third Reich. In this radicalized context, the always excluded other, the ugly flip side of the good form, turned into an other that was in line with the Third Reich's racialized culture. These ideas were also related to the broader context of European colonialism. The magazine In Dekoration, which was close to the Werkpunkt, published an article in 1938, for instance, which defined style as a necessary outcome of both the race's and the nation's human form. European officials, even missionaries who serve in the colonies, have to come back to Europe from time to time in order to find back to the European human form which they gradually lose in the countries of dark-skinned people, unquote. The racial other represents the absence of a civilized live expression and evokes an existential danger of alienation that Europeans and Germans face if they mingle too intensely with non-European cultures. In the 1953 Marshall Plan exhibition, We Are Building a Better Life, this exhibition had successfully introduced the idea of a recognizably modern aesthetics of the home in Western Europe and the USA. We have to be interested actually in the borders of post-war cosmopolitanism to even notice that although black GIs had become normal part of West German everyday life, African Americans were absent from images promoting the American home abroad. That being Western implied being white was accepted as self-evident and thereby also informed the post-war conceptions of the modern home. So it implied that, sorry. And in line with this observation, with this implication, architectural historian Diane Harris has recently shown how both the imaginary and the practice of modern homes in the growing US American suburbs continued structural racial segregation in new forms. While the explicit evocation of race disappeared from the post-war West German discourse on the modern home, the dichotomy between the moralized good form and dubious deviations from it remained paramount. This contrast, I argue, implicitly continued to build on a colonial division of the world. As the development of this post-war discourse was intertwined with the emerging concept of the West, its internationalism necessarily reflected the European and white exclusivity of this West. So the West German magazine Magnum was founded in 1953, the same year as the exhibition, to provide a Western internationalist forum on the modern character of the present, paying special attention to the form of everyday objects. The editorial of the first number reformulated a totalizing vision of society as an organic whole and embraced modern design as the expression of a, quote, new historic type of human, calling anybody a misfit who, quote, evades this development. The images presented modern design and architecture from the USA, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, Italy, and sometimes France and England. The captions informed the readers about the objects, designers, and their national origin. The juxtaposition of images informed them about the fact that they were looking at an aesthetically homogeneous appearance of this West. For the 1957 Interbau exhibition, architects from different countries built model social housing units to construct a new Hansa neighborhood in West Berlin. A large majority of the architects and designers came from the northern parts of Europe, especially Germany and Scandinavia. A small number was French and Italian. Brazil was represented by Oskar Niemeyer and the USA by Walter Gropius. The Werkbund published a book which documented the interior designs of the exhibition. The text hailed the project for its, quote, global harmony, and the international designers for establishing an organic relationship between the domestic space and the, quote, human being of today, unquote. The stylistic homogeneity of the model interiors appeared like the dreamscape of an ideal social world. What did not harmonize with these design spaces, however, was seen as a moral catastrophe in danger of falling outside of the social itself. So both in this first Magnum issue and in the Werkbund's Interbau publication, the proclaimed international character of modern design was used to reformulate on a supranational level older assumptions about the relationship between the aesthetics of everyday objects and the undisturbed social harmony and homogeneity previously ascribed to the German nation. Exclusion on the basis of cultural and racial hierarchies was built into this discourse in a subtle manner. An illustrated volume on international modern architecture and design, published in 1955, presented houses that were built by architects from all over the world and stood in Germany, Italy, Holland, the US, Japan, Switzerland, and South Africa. According to the author, the South African house could just as well be found in Germany because, quote, the ideas about modern dwelling and living are obviously shared by the progressive people in the whole world. Adding that, quote, this thought produces much hope and somehow in the subconscious, the belief in a true to life organic development of our human community, unquote. South Africa at the time had already received international criticism for having installed a system of racial segregation called apartheid in 1948. Including the country in this way in 1955 meant that the international community at the basis of the book's vision of a globalized modern home was supposed to be white. Inviting readers to furnish their homes with design objects from various countries was certainly an innovation with respect to the Nazi past. This new cosmopolitan trend, however, did not include non-European or non-Western countries in the same way. Orientalist exoticism and patterns of thought played a significant role in post-war popular culture and also entered the West German discourse on modern design. The Oriental work, with its centuries-long presence in European culture, held a special place, representing both Oriental difference and Western expert knowledge about Eastern traditions. In this capacity, Oriental works had also regularly been integrated into modern interiors from the 1920s, actually onwards. From the mid-1950s, the Oriental carpet was present again in West Germany as a German quality product, which expertly appropriated a foreign influence and was compatible with modern interiors. Even though the African and the Oriental activated different sets of associations, both were identified with inferior cultures and a lack of civilization in a way that made it possible to position post-war consumer ideals against and above them. An ad that contained both versions of exoticism was published in March 1958 by the label Bessemer Carpets. It shows 5 adults standing and sitting on and around a modern sofa and a wooden table at the rear end of a large Oriental rug. At the center of the scene, the man of the house smiles and points with his index finger toward an African mask, which is being held by the woman next to him. In his other hand, the man holds the printed brochure. A second African mask lies on the table. Through the physical relationship between the people and these objects, the scene radiates a sense of cultural mastery and of ownership. The man points to the mask with a gesture that speaks both of his expert knowledge and of his owner's pride, whereas the carpet, called a masterpiece, represents the Europeanized appropriation of a foreign cultural influence into the idealized sphere of the modern home. The mask is staged as an exotic foreign object that is subjugated to a superior regime of knowledge and power. Published only a year after Franziska had hit West German cinema screens, the ad shows similarities with the use of African masks in this film. In the redecorated home in Passau, in the south of Germany, African masks occupy a special place. They hover in the scene left above when Franziska's father morally lectures Stefan before accepting him as a son-in-law, and they are visible when Franziska accuses Stefan of treating her like one of his pleasing curiosities. One can therefore read the presence of the African masks not only as a sign of Franziska's aesthetic expertise, but also as a visual reminder of the looming danger that Stefan might relapse into a world of cultural and racial ambiguity. The film's release coincided with an increased attention for antiques and non-European art objects in the Lifestyle magazine. In 1956, the magazine Constanze reported on the booming antique business and invited readers to play explorer, quote, unravel the object's secrets and establish a, quote, inner relation with them. The article presented a whole wall filled with non-European masks whose original function explained as fending off demons. Where the process of decolonization was in swing and had started, primitive artworks and the Orientals surfaced in the West German discourse of the late 1950s as exotic in the sense of the space of an other outside or beyond the confines of a civilization. And thus they invited German readers to assume a superior knowledge position as Westerners. In 1956, last example, the magazine Constanze humorously announced that, quote, the savages don't live so uncomfortable after all. And it presented exhibits from an ethnic museum on photographs with a smiling young woman attempting to sit on or eat from household utensils from Cameroon, the Congo, and the Amazon that were all characterized by as amazingly simple, functional, and even beautifully crafted. They fit in exactly with their environment and with the people who use them, something that cannot be said about some of the modern furniture in our homes. Including African artworks into the area of modern living with its emphasis on the simple and functional in this ironic manner effectively underlined their primitiveness. The awkward ambiguity of the piece, however, indicated that something had begun to shift. 8 months later, the same magazine declared self-reflexively that the recent independence of African states had to change, quote, our image of the Negroes, unquote, who had started to, quote, study astrophysics, while in our thoughts, we still decorate these people with glass pots and colorful cotton flags, unquote. So 65 years later, meaning now, similar kinds of objects which were once awkwardly used in such magazine articles to position non-European people again outside the sphere of a cosmopolitan modern and thereby of civilization, these kinds of objects are now the topic of heated debates about the moral responsibility of ethnic museums to deal with their collections' colonial legacy and with the traces of violence inscribed in many of their collected items. In the aftermath of the Second World War, which generated the political meanings of modern design, whose homely and unhomely qualities I have tried to dissect here, was not a post-colonial moment. The attraction of modern cosmopolitanism as an imaginary of post-war consumerism in West Germany consisted to a considerable extent in its capacity to obscure its own history and to convey myths that felt homely because they contained and concealed the unhomely within themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie, very much for your interesting talk, and I really appreciate this methodology of researching using the material as films and magazines, and it's amazing. I really love it, you know. But why do you?
Should I stop? Yes, I do. So. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to see. Yeah, people have to think. There is no question. I have to look at my mobile to see the questions if they come in. I could not stop thinking when you're talking at the end about the not post-colonial so it's still colonial style, and when Africa came in as an example, I'm always puzzled. Sorry, it's not direct to the point of your talk, but it reminds me Leni Riefenstahl and the way she built all the Nazi aesthetics in films. And she was never caught. She was never imprisoned for that. And then later, she made a documentary in Africa, and she filmed the black bodies in the same way as she did with Hitler. So it's only something that occurred me, and it puzzled me a lot. And I wonder if you have something to say about it.
On Riefenstahl, but of course, I mean, I know I've seen images. I haven't seen the documentary. But it's if I've learned something in the last years, also teaching about these topics, it's that how exoticism works in different ways is really complicated topic, because it's always there's always, of course, an attraction, right? So it's always and some people, some scholars have said, like, the basis is actually to be fascinated by what your own culture excludes in many ways, and therefore being attracted to it. But in the way you are attracted, you are confirming basically the splitting off, right? You're confirming that this is something completely different. And without knowing these films completely, I would think that would probably be the first angle from which I would look at them. But listen, what fascinates me is exactly the whole question of what this moment is. In German history, relatively clear. I mean, there's a sort of clearness of there's a regime that ends. And then after that, how this is the same question as, so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to put together what does the change of regime mean, and how can old ideas kind of continue in different forms in a new political framework, which is in many ways the question that post-colonial scholars have asked in many ways, and which has inspired me, and also in many ways to ask these questions. And this means, there's a heated debate at the moment in political, in magazines and newspapers about how to, what to do with the German past in relation to the colonial past. And there are many people say this is completely different, right? It's nothing to do with each other. And if we go there, we're kind of touching the horror of the Nazi past and the Holocaust, whereas, my generation of historians and all this work that has been done in the last 20 years shows the opposite, shows that, of course, there were very specific things about the Holocaust and about the Nazi version of building an empire. But at the same time, you cannot at all understand them if you don't relate them to the context of European colonialism, which means that if you want to get a grip on the legacy of it after 1945, you have to do the same, right? You can't completely tear those things apart. And this is in a way what has informed my readings, right? And my traveling from one weird example to the next and trying to make sense of it. This is what I'm trying to do, I guess.
Fascinating. Very nice. And there is a question here. Oh, there are two questions. One from Tiago Quiroga. The aesthetics of domestic life plays an important role in the cosmopolitan imagery. Mm-hmm. At the same time, the latter is determined by global identities. In political terms, what does it mean to be at home as a synonym with belonging to the globe?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, yeah. I mean, for me, there's a personal, I have tried to kind of integrate it in the way I presented, that there's a personal story of discovering cultural contexts which used to kind of explain the world to me and were attractive as identity positions in a way, right? And of course, modern aesthetics were part of that and are part of that in many ways. But the research I've done has taught me that although there's no inherent meaning, right? I'm not saying that there's an inherent meaning in these forms. The meaning can be changed and has been changed. But I've understood that there is some weird form of exclusion in the very attempt to create, forms of maybe more global identity, right? And by the way, this exclusion is also social, right? It's not only racial or cultural, but it's also social. Like there's this, I've come across examples where designers in Germany in the 80s, they were desperate that they couldn't convince workers of these kinds of, simplified and reduced aesthetics. And they were thinking, because of the myth, actually, that this was because workers had been more attracted by Nazism, and because Nazism was opposed to these ideas, which is not true, but that was the myth. Yeah? That was what everybody believed. So what you see is that there's a kind of exclusion, ostracizing of workers because they were connected to what was culturally foreign, right? So I just became much more aware of kind of the pitfalls, right, of certain ways to imagine a global identity. And I've quoted these films in the beginning because that's another way of just shaking up the way one's usual perceptions, which actually doesn't answer the question of how you can build. I don't know if there's something as a global identity. I'm not sure, but that's I'm a historian, so of course I think about these things, but not really in a scholarly way.
Oh, okay. I have two more questions for you, Josef Früchtel. Tiago asks a very interesting question about home and globalization. I'm not connected to Carla. What? Sorry, but not connect. But I would like to hear an answer from Natalie about this.
About identity and globalization.
About home and globalization.
This is, what can I say? What I see, what I study are the ways in which home has been both defined as as a national thing, which has, there's in all European countries, and certainly in Germany, there's a strong tradition of that. And that has been transformed into a more international thing, which, has positive aspects, right? What I've done here, what I do here is focusing on the usually not visible edge of that the very way in which the home has been imagined as more like, let's say, transnational, has been connected with very specific ways of defining an outside, right? And I'm not, I as a historian, I don't say if it's possible to define a home in cultural terms without an outside or without an outside in such a way. I just, I feel a responsibility to trace the ways of exclusion and how that kind of mirrors back onto, the identity formation, precisely because I think it's important to see it and to understand these ways of identifying with cultural formations. So that's what I do. I can't answer these are for me also. I don't know. It's puzzling, and we are in a time where everybody discusses identity in every way, and I don't, everything that's too clear, that maybe that I can answer. Everything that sounds and seems and looks clear when it comes to kind of collective forms identity is for me like there's something very problematic about that. because of course reality is always more complex than that, and that is true for smaller groups, and it's even more true when it comes to claiming a global identity, of course.
Okay, there is another one. I don't know who made the question, but it's thinking in Lefebvre and Certeau, how does this shift in the house is related to the capitalistic appropriation of the everyday life dimension, especially in the post-war?
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely part. I mean, I've used the term capitalist once, right? But of course, this is part of it. I mean, the most interesting thinkers, indeed, is Certeau and others, but of course, Roland Barthes and French thinkers of the 60s, I read them as being absolutely puzzled by how important these domestic objects, not only domestic objects, but these commodities have become in creating visions of a good life that were somehow, they were overdetermined, but at the same time, completely in a way, their relationship to history was completely unreadable, right? And this is, Roland Barthes' idea of myth is very much about that. It's very much about how, in a way that kind of capitalism reinvented itself, which was ingrained in it, always, right? I mean, capitalism can integrate nostalgia, but this is kind of completely, it's a fantasy world of history, right? And it can make something look old, which is new, and it can make things look new, which are actually old. Like that is the sphere of kind of how in capitalism meaning is created, especially in advertising. And so this for me is part of that. And of course, the crisis was also a crisis of capitalism, which was very quickly kind of pushed away, among others, by the Marshall Plan and the accompanying propaganda, which was all about making disappear also capitalism's history, basically. It was all about forgetting that there ever was any problem and about convincing everybody that you only have to produce kind of efficiently and to trade, and every problem is solved. So there's no ideology. It's all magically kind of solves every problem. That was the content of much of Marshall Plan propaganda, which was of course also defending democracy, right? Not to forget, but it was a democracy built on this idea. So yeah, it's deeply related to these issues.
Oh, so the name of the author of the question was Lucille Melo. He came later. And there is the last one, because then we have to finish for the next conference, from Pedro Brauli. Natalie, thank you for the wonderful presentation. It's really interesting how the use of the African masks in modern interior design is depicted in the magazines you have shown us. Would you say that the modern architecture, in an attempt to integralize cultures all in one space, actually perpetuates the colonial idea by standardizing the space as an European model, by thinking lesser cultures only as decoration? That's a good question.
I mean, that's actually, I shortened my lecture, but there was, I was mentioning a scholar, a colleague who's worked on France, Daniel Sherman, and was very much focused on sort of the highbrow discourse and how specifically in France that happened. And there was like a new kind of idea about style, which included these basically primitive art. And it's yes, I agree, but I also think it's more complicated, right? As always. So I agree that that it is there's Daniel Sherman writes, somehow the French have tried to make sense of this period, and they actually have tried to create new aesthetics ideals that that could include, the decolonizing world, the post-colonial world in a new way. And so that's not everything bad, but of course it means that you position these objects in a very specific way, and that means you don't change, as it were, the framework. You just give them a new position in the framework, thereby also not only acknowledging it but giving value to it, right? So that is the positive side. But it is a two-edged sword. I think it opens up other possibilities, and it opens up, it's maybe a first step in actually engaging in a different way. But it's also, and it has always been a lot about sort of an imagined reality, right? I mean, I have a friend who's worked on the whole trade in so-called primitive objects that were produced for the market by Africans and had nothing to do with their culture, but because Europeans wanted to have them in their homes. So, okay, they said, let's going to produce what they want. But, the consumers think that they have authentic African culture in their homes, whereas that is absolutely not the case. So it's complicated. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we have lots of things to say, to talk, but we have to finish. And I'm very glad, and I hope you can come personally next time and visit us in a better time. And thank you very much in the name of all the organizers. And
thank everybody. Thank everybody who listened very much.
See you next time. Thank you, Natalie.
Bye.
Bye.